My wife said she was going on a business trip. She said it with that practiced naturalness, her gaze fixed on her phone, her mouth too busy with coffee to linger on any explanation. It was Tuesday when she left, small suitcase, high heels, perfume lingering. I stood there in the doorway, watching the elevator close like someone watching the end of an episode that promises a bitter sequel. And it did. The feeling was hard to explain. It wasn't exactly distrust. It was something more subtle. An uneasiness inside, a discomfort I couldn't tell if it was jealousy, insecurity, or intuition. But it was persistent, like a thorn under a nail. I got in the car late in the afternoon and drove to the hotel where she said she was staying. Out of curiosity, I convinced myself. Out of fear of becoming paranoid, I tried to believe her. But what I saw wasn't fiction. They got out of the car together. The boss and her. Holding hands. Smiling. She looked at him with the same look that had once been mine. With that affection that she once pretended was only mine. They entered the hotel like a solid couple, no guilt on their faces, no hesitation in their steps. The impact was blunt. I didn't scream, I didn't chase after them. I didn't want to confirm what was already obvious. I returned to the car, sat down, and just sent a short message, "You don't have to come back." And that was it. I left carrying a silence that had screamed inside me for days, for weeks. She returned on Thursday, with practiced calm and artificial lightness. When she walked through the front door, she found not the husband she'd left behind, but a man already saying goodbye. She drawled my name, as if still expecting to hear a "Hi, love." But all she found was silence. She set her suitcase down and began saying she needed to talk, that it wasn't what it seemed, that I was overreacting. And I just stared. Her mouth moved, but the words couldn't bridge the distance she'd created. Finally, she stopped trying. I left. Not physically, yet. But inside, something in me closed the door. Something she could never reach again. She tried, persisted for weeks. She texted late at night, left notes around the house, cooked dinners as if the spice could heal the damage. But it was too late. Because it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about everything that died the moment I saw that smile she reserved for another man. And him? The boss? Gone. Evaporated like smoke. As soon as she started talking about the future, about commitment, about what we are now, he vanished. He took away his body, his affection, and his compliments, leaving her alone in the void she'd created with her own hands. The silence that remained between us was too heavy for any excuse to sustain. And yet, she stayed. As if she could rebuild everything with actions that no longer meant anything. But I carried on. Little by little, in my own time. I rebuilt my foundation, reorganized my heart. And in the midst of it all, someone appeared. Without promising anything, without trampling over my rubble. They were just there. With calm eyes, a constant presence, and a look that reminded me of who I was before I felt betrayed. It wasn't easy to trust again. But she didn't ask that of me. She simply offered me peace. And it was like that, in the silence of a new beginning, that I discovered it was still possible to be loved, truly. Months later, when the dust seemed to have finally settled, my ex-wife reappeared. With puffy eyes, a shaky voice, and a plea for forgiveness that sought no response. She wanted to see me. She said she needed it, that she couldn't move on without closing the cycle. I went. Out of curiosity, perhaps. Or to test myself. She started talking. She said she didn't sleep well, that she regretted it every day, that she thought of me every time she saw a couple on the street. She said she didn't know what she was looking for when she cheated. That she felt invisible in her marriage, that she wanted to feel desired. And that she chose the wrong path to do so. There was no justification, only an attempt at an explanation. I listened to it all. With the calm of someone who no longer hurt. And when she finished, when she finally looked at me as if expecting a hug, I simply said, I forgive you. Not to go back. Not to start over. Just to end it. She cried. So did I. But it was the kind of crying that cleanses, not stains. And there, in that final encounter, I was certain that what we had experienced was in the past. That what we were no longer has a place in the present. But what she never expected was that, when she tried to reconnect, when she looked for my house, when she knocked on my door again, the one who answered would be the very woman who now shares my life. The new one. The one who stayed when everything inside me was still a wreck. She expected a confrontation. Maybe even a scandal. What she found was politeness. It was lightness. The new woman looked at her with empathy. With a discreet smile and a firm voice, she said, I know who you are. And I know how much you meant to him. Don't worry, he's fine now. Very fine. The ex was speechless. Her voice cracked. She tried to hide the impact, but her eyes betrayed it. The new woman didn't humiliate, didn't expose. But she showed, with maturity, that the place that was once hers was now occupied by someone who understood, cared, and loved, truly. She left in silence, the same silence she left between us when she chose to cheat. But this time, the silence was hers. And it hurt. Life went on. For me, with peace. For her, with the weight of a choice without return. And even though the world says time heals all, some wounds only heal when we learn to accept that not every lost love can be redeemed. And that sometimes, the true punishment isn't being hated, it's being forgotten. But there's something she doesn't yet know. Something that happened just before she showed up at that door. A small revelation that completely transformed how I felt about her, and about myself. And that's what changes everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, no type of betrayal is romanticized or encouraged. All the stories you hear are fiction, but the feelings they arouse are real, because betrayal, in real life, destroys bonds, trust and futures. Our purpose is clear, to show, through intense stories, how a wrong choice can leave deep and irreversible scars. Get ready to dive into another story, shocking, emotional and unforgettable. Take a deep breath. The pain will begin. His name was Daniel. Hers was Laura. A couple who, for a long time, were described by everyone around them as the epitome of complicity, partnership, and love that matures over time. They had been together for almost 10 years, and of that time, 7 were spent under the same roof, between shared sheets, shared routines, and dreams that seemed to be moving in the same direction. They met in college, in a seminar on interpersonal communication. Daniel was more reserved, observant, the kind who speaks little but absorbs everything, while Laura exuded an engaging spontaneity, always with an easy smile, a witty sense of humor, and an almost natural ability to win people over with a look. The beginning was almost shy, as if they were both silently testing each other, until a long coffee on a rainy afternoon changed the tone of the conversation, and since then, they have never been apart. Their life together began simply. A rented apartment, used furniture, lots of notes stuck to the fridge, and more desire than resources. But there was beauty in it. There was truth. Laura said she never cared about luxury, and Daniel found in her a sense of freedom that made him breathe easier. He worked in advertising photography and spent a lot of time in closed studios, with tight deadlines, demanding clients, and artificial lights. Laura, on the other hand, graduated in marketing and rose quickly in the corporate events field. She was charismatic, creative, knew how to transform ideas into experiences, and was promoted frequently, until she reached a leadership position that required more travel, more late-night meetings, more closing parties and get-togethers. Gradually, their routines began to drift apart, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. In the early years, there was a likeness between them that enchanted everyone around them. The impromptu dinners, the last-minute trips to nearby cities, the lazy Sundays where they spent the entire day in their pajamas watching old movies. There was laughter amidst the chaos, plans made in the wee hours of the morning, and a connection that made it seem like nothing could shake them. Laura was extremely communicative, and Daniel, though more introspective, loved listening to her talk. He felt safe there, as if he had finally found his place in the world. And Laura said she loved the way he looked at her, as if he saw parts of her that even she herself hadn't known. They had long conversations, sometimes deep, sometimes banal, but always ending with some kind of affectionate gesture, a subtle touch, or a simple, "Stay a little longer." Over time, the situation changed. More serious commitments arrived, the purchase of their first apartment, financial responsibilities, the demands of work, the stress of daily life. Laura began arriving home later and later, justifying herself with tight deadlines and difficult clients. Daniel, for his part, spent more time at home, tending to household details, preparing meals, trying to keep a flame alive that, little by little, seemed to be receiving less oxygen. He noticed changes, small withdrawals disguised as fatigue, less enthusiastic responses, subtle absences in conversations that once flowed naturally. Still, he persisted. There was no trace of distrust in Daniel, only a sense of emotional responsibility, of wanting to protect what they had built together. Laura was grateful for this. She always said she admired his patience, the way he understood her, the way he didn't make a fuss when she had to cancel a dinner or a trip. But Daniel didn't want to be understanding, he wanted to be a priority. And he never said that out loud. He kept his small frustrations to himself, turning into silence any words that might sound like demands. Perhaps out of fear of appearing fragile, perhaps because he believed it was just a phase. And perhaps it was. After all, every couple goes through moments of misalignment, of a burdensome routine, of too much silence or too few words. But as the months passed, what was once an exception became a habit. Laura started sleeping later, leaving earlier, and when she was home, she seemed too tired to talk. Daniel observed everything, felt it, but preferred not to react. He held out hope that, with time and patience, everything would return to the way it was. Laura's social media reflected an active and intense life. Photos at events, smiles with coworkers, motivational quotes, and check-ins at hotels and fancy restaurants. Daniel, more discreet, posted little. He preferred to capture moments with his eyes and keep them in his memory. But sometimes, seeing a photo of her with a group of people he didn't know, he felt an uncomfortable pang. Not exactly jealousy, but exclusion. A realization that there were parts of her life he was no longer a part of. He tried to participate. He asked about events, colleagues, places. Laura responded hurriedly, often without detail, as if the stories had already been told before, to other people. The house filled with silences. They weren't arguments. They were absences. Unspoken absences, postponed conversations, spared touches. And despite all this, Daniel still looked at her with love. Friday nights, once sacred to them both, became lonely. She'd say she was exhausted or that she had a business dinner. He said it was fine, but inside, he felt pushed into a zone of invisibility where his desires no longer seemed to matter. At work, he was starting to lose focus. The photos no longer came out with the same sensitivity, the briefings seemed dull, and he often found himself checking his phone, waiting for a message from her, even though he knew she'd probably only respond hours later. Still, he wouldn't give up. He planned a weekend trip. A getaway out of town, just the two of them. She declined, saying she couldn't take time off because of an important client. He tried to understand. He said it was okay. And, as always, he was the one who gave in. As always, he was the one who recalculated the route to keep their path at least minimally intact. Deep down, Daniel harbored a quiet optimism, a kind of hope that made him believe Laura was simply overwhelmed, that work was demanding too much, that she loved him, she just didn't know how to show it anymore. After all, she still said she loved him. She still slept beside him. She still wore her wedding ring. Small gestures that, though cold, still existed. He clung to them. To the details that remained. The way she said goodbye before leaving, the coffee she sometimes left ready, the perfume she wore, which he always associated with affection. But these gestures were becoming automatic. And even though he couldn't explain it, Daniel sensed something was off. A lack of sparkle in her eyes, a lack of urgency to return home, a rush to sleep without saying goodnight. But he didn't question. He just observed. He just felt. Because he still believed. Because he still loved. And even with the obvious distance, he still made plans with her. He still imagined children, trips, a shared old age. There was a mature, resilient love in him, accepting the ups and downs of life as a couple. Laura, for her part, seemed increasingly distant from this construct. As if she were already on another wavelength. And yet, she never mentioned separation. Never suggested a break, a serious conversation. She remained there, physically present, emotionally distant. As if she were waiting for something. Or someone. Daniel didn't know. And he preferred not to imagine. That afternoon when she said she was going on a business trip, he didn't suspect a thing. Her voice was steady, her expression calm. But something in her gaze, there was a strange detail, a microsecond of hesitation that he noticed but ignored. Maybe fatigue, maybe tension. She spoke of the hotel, the demanding client, the tight deadline. He simply nodded, wished her a safe trip, and watched as she closed the door. Once again, alone. And that's when everything started to change. Laura began to change almost imperceptibly. Mornings became more rushed, glances briefer, words more calculated. Daniel, as much as he tried to convince himself it was all due to stress, the professional rush, or even the natural wear and tear of years together, felt a silent uneasiness growing, settling like dust under the furniture, discreet but constant. He observed the details, the small delays that were once occasional and now became the norm, the way she hid her cell phone whenever he approached, the increasing number of meetings that stretched late, the vague smiles that appeared when she thought no one was looking. And even though he didn't want to admit it, his heart began to doubt its own peace. On weekends, Laura seemed more distant, as if her mind were elsewhere. Conversations became practical, objective, and shallow. She talked about spreadsheets, schedules, upcoming events, and avoided questions about feelings, memories, or what had once united them. Daniel tried to find moments to reconnect, organizing home-cooked dinners, playing songs they used to listen to together, and even suggesting a photo shoot to capture a new cycle for them. Laura declined with a tense smile, saying she wasn't in the mood for it, that she was overwhelmed with tasks and just needed to rest. "I'm not in the mood" became a recurring phrase. The feeling of being ignored by someone you love is a silent form of pain. Daniel didn't feel anger, not yet. What took hold of him was a dry sadness, a feeling of inadequacy, as if he'd stopped being enough without even knowing why. He began to doubt himself, to look for flaws that might justify her distance. He wondered if he'd stopped being interesting, if the silence he maintained to avoid conflict had turned into disinterest, if the patience he offered had been interpreted as weakness. He tried to talk, but his conversations always met with curt answers, accumulated fatigue, and glances that fled. One night, Laura arrived home after 11. Daniel was still awake, and she came in saying the meeting had gone on longer than expected, that the new client required an extra presentation, that the traffic was terrible. He wanted to believe her. But something in her tone was different. She was in too much of a hurry to explain the time, and her eyes avoided his for longer than usual. She went straight to the shower, and Daniel stood there, staring at the closed bedroom door, with a restlessness that seemed to tear at him. The next day, she woke up early, earlier than usual, and left in a hurry, saying she had an important breakfast with the director of a multinational company, and that it was crucial to look impeccable. She was more dressed up than usual, with well-done makeup, high heels, and strong perfume. Daniel said nothing. He just watched. He didn't know what to do. He began to feel like a stranger in his own home. The bed seemed too big, the sofa too cold, the solitary dinners too long. The photographs that once decorated the walls now seemed like framed ironies. He tried every way to change things, even planning simple surprises, notes left on the mirror, loving messages throughout the day, but the response was always lukewarm. An emoji, a thank you, love, and that was it. And the more he tried, the further she pulled away, as if the love that had endured so many phases was now being suffocated by something invisible. Daniel began to notice something he hadn't noticed before. Laura spent a lot of time texting on her phone, even when they were sitting next to each other on the couch. She giggled quietly, sometimes typing quickly and then immediately locking the screen. And there was a name that kept coming up in conversations, one she mentioned in passing, Gustavo. A new manager at the partner company, someone with whom she was coordinating an important project. Daniel tried to ignore it, tried to believe it was just a coincidence, a professional connection. But the mentions were too frequent, and there was a hesitation whenever he asked any question involving that name. Then the trip came up. Laura casually announced that she would be away for 2 days for a conference in another city. She said it would be rushed, with little free time, and that she would barely have time to rest. Daniel, upon hearing this, felt something tighten in his chest. An intuition that wasn't backed by proof, but by an instinctive certainty. He didn't show it at the time. He simply agreed, wished her luck, and watched her pack. Her favorite shirt, which she never wore to ordinary events, was there, as were her new heels that hadn't even come out of the box yet, the perfume she only wore on special occasions. And then, the next day, when she left, Daniel sat in the living room for long minutes. In silence. The idea of following her came unplanned. It was something that grew as the hours passed, fueled by anguish and fear. He got in the car late in the afternoon and drove to the hotel where she said she was staying. He didn't expect to see anything. He didn't want to confirm the worst. Maybe, deep down, he was just trying to ease his mind. But as he parked and waited from a distance, he saw it. With his own eyes. Laura getting out of a car with Gustavo. They were smiling. Their hands intertwined. Her body leaned slightly toward him, as if seeking intimacy. And the two entered the hotel as if they already knew the way, as if they had done this before. Like a couple. Daniel didn't move. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he didn't care. He just watched. And in his chest, something broke, violently, but also clearly. He returned home, unable to breathe properly. He sat on the bed, looking at her clothes in the closet, the picture frames on the nightstand, the remains of a life built together. And in that moment, he made a decision. He sent a short message. Just one sentence, without hate, without drama. You don't have to come back anymore. And he went to sleep with his body heavy and his soul in pieces. The next morning, he woke to find his phone full of her messages, missed calls, long audio messages. He didn't respond. He spent the day in silence. He spent the days in silence. She returned 2 days later. She rang the doorbell as if nothing had happened. He opened the door and looked at her with the same pain he'd felt at the hotel. She tried to explain, tried to defend herself, but there was no way. She knew. And so did he. Even with the betrayal blatantly obvious, Daniel didn't shout at her. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't demand anything. He simply turned his back and headed for the bedroom, leaving her standing in the living room, trying to find a word that didn't exist. That night, they slept in separate beds. And from then on, everything was different. In the days that followed, she tried to regain control, to feign normalcy. But what existed between them now was an irreversible void. Daniel saw her with new eyes. And even though it still hurt, he was beginning to prepare himself to accept it. What he didn't know, what she never had the courage to tell him, was that there was more. Much more. And that part, he would only discover when he was ready to move on. When there was no more love to be saved. Laura tried everything to get back to her routine. After that trip, even though she found the front door less welcoming and Daniel more absent than ever, she acted as if it were possible to reverse the irreversible. She persisted in conversations that died in the air, in affectionate gestures that he no longer responded to, in implicit promises that things would return to normal. But Daniel was no longer the same. And she knew it. Deep down, she knew his silence wasn't a pause, it was a full stop. The lack of confrontation was the biggest sign that he had already given up trying to understand. And the way he looked at her, without anger, but also without tenderness, made it clear that something inside him had broken. A point of no return. The betrayal had only been the trigger. The disconnection had been going on for much longer, but it was there, in that hotel, that everything revealed itself. And even with the betrayal uncovered, the real blow was yet to come. Laura began insisting on talking. She begged him to listen, saying there was more he didn't know, trying to reconstruct some narrative that could at least clear some of the guilt. Daniel, exhausted, finally relented. They sat face to face one Sunday afternoon in the living room that no longer smelled like home. She took a deep breath and began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, that she knew she had destroyed something that had taken years to build. But she needed to tell the truth. She said her relationship with Gustavo had begun months earlier, that it wasn't planned, that it was emotional before it was physical. That she felt alone, invisible, and that he, the other, knew exactly where to touch her. Daniel listened, without interrupting, without reacting, as if he had already accepted the fall and now just watched the rubble crumble. Until she said something that changed everything. That she had gone to his house. But not to apologize. To ask for something she felt she deserved. Daniel frowned, not understanding. And that was when, with a broken voice, she told him what she had done. After he sent that message saying he didn't need to come back, she didn't go straight home. She went to Gustavo's apartment. She arrived there late in the afternoon, still wearing her makeup from the day, the weight of rejection written all over her face. He greeted her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected to face the consequences. She entered uninvited, saying that Daniel had discovered everything and that now they could be together, they could live this life without hiding. Gustavo backed away, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to stall for time, make excuses, saying she was shaken and that it wasn't time to make decisions. But Laura, through tears, insisted. She said she'd left everything, that she'd been exposed, that her husband had left her, and that she had nowhere to go. Gustavo remained silent. Then he got up, went to the door, and, in a low voice, told her she had to leave. In that moment, Laura understood there was no promise, that everything they had experienced was just a convenient detour in his life. And the door closed. She didn't tell him this expecting empathy. She knew Daniel no longer had room for compassion. She told him because she needed to share the burden. Because she couldn't bear the guilt and contempt alone any longer. Daniel listened to everything, leaning back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. When she finished, he simply said he hoped she would one day be able to forgive herself. And he left. But he didn't leave the room. He left the story. In the following days, he began preparing his final exit. He asked for time off from work, quietly organized his things, sold some of the equipment he used for freelance work, and with the money, bought a ticket to the coast. He said he needed to breathe, to find new air. Laura remained in the house, alone, with the bed untouched, the empty pictures, and the sounds of absence filling every space. What she didn't know was that he had already met someone. A woman he'd bumped into by chance at a small coffee shop where he used to go on his hardest days. She was discreet, smiling, and seemed to possess a peace that contrasted with his chaos. They started talking about coffee, then books, old movies. They exchanged numbers, kept in touch. He didn't want anything at first, but she gradually became close, subtly, delicately. She was someone who didn't demand more from him than he could give. Who respected the silences, but also knew how to fill the voids. Over time, Daniel found himself smiling again. Small smiles, but sincere. And before he knew it, she was already part of his new routine. Not as a replacement, but as something new. Something weightless. He still didn't call it love. But it was peace. And after all, that was more than he could ask for. A few months passed. Daniel was starting over in a new city, with a new life. Laura, meanwhile, continued trying to rebuild what was left of herself. She spent her days between therapy sessions, frustrated attempts at professional relocation, and her nights immersed in relentless regrets. One day, she decided she needed to see him. Not to win him back, but to put an end to the story once and for all. She sent a brief message, asking to talk. He, with the maturity of someone no longer bleeding, accepted. They arranged to meet for a coffee, midweek, neutral, meaningless. Laura arrived first, anxious, her hands sweaty, her gaze lost. When Daniel walked in, he was different. Lighter. There was a calmness about him that hurt more than any rejection. They sat down, greeted each other politely, and she began to talk. She apologized again, cried, thanked him for everything they'd been through, said she understood if he hated her. Daniel took a deep breath. He said he didn't hate her. That she was an important part of his life. That her mistake didn't erase everything they'd built. But that life had moved on. And that he was at peace now. Laura smiled, through her tears. She said that, somehow, this comforted her. And as she was preparing to say goodbye, she asked an unexpected question. She wanted to know who he was with. If there was anyone. Daniel hesitated. He said yes, but that he didn't want to go into details. She persisted, not out of jealousy, but out of curiosity. He then told her, simply, about the woman he'd met at the coffee shop. And that was when everything changed. Laura stood still. Her face pale, her eyes frozen. She mumbled a name. And Daniel confirmed it. It was her. The woman Laura had always envied. An old college classmate, whom Laura used to dismiss with harsh comments, saying she was too simple, too dull, that she would never understand the kind of life they led. And now, it was her. That woman who had always remained in the background. The one Laura never considered a threat. It was with her that Daniel was rebuilding his life. And when Laura asked to see her, to at least get to know who she was today, Daniel invited her to his house. The next day, Laura showed up. And it was she who answered the door. The woman who now shared Daniel's life, his plans, his peace. But instead of rejecting her or acting dismissive, she was kind. Smiling. And with a serenity that cut through her, she said she knew who she was. She respected their past. And that she was happy he was at peace now. There was no anger in her voice. Only maturity. Laura, unmoored, tried to maintain her composure. But inside, something crumbled. That hurt more than all the losses. Because it wasn't humiliation. It was compassion. And it completely disarmed her. In that moment, she understood the true punishment. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't the betrayal discovered. It was seeing, with her own eyes, that he had been loved by someone better. That he had found in another woman what she never knew how to give. And that, despite everything, she had still been treated with respect. The past was over, and she was now just a memory he knew how to forgive. But would never return. There, at the end of that hallway, before that door opened by another woman, she knew with certainty that the love she lost could never be regained. And the silence of that farewell would be the echo that would accompany her forever. Laura stood before that door for longer than she should have, her eyes still fixed on the image she never thought she would witness. The woman before her, so calm, so serene, so self-assured, was not just a reminder of everything she had lost, but the embodiment of what she had never been able to be. The visit she had planned as an attempt at closure now became an exposed wound, deep, irreversible. There was a kind of harmony in the atmosphere of that house that Laura recognized immediately, but not as a memory, but as an absence. It was what she had always lacked: balance, simplicity, truth. And no matter how hard she tried to maintain her composure, her gaze betrayed the turmoil building within. Pride struggled to sustain her, but pain seeped through her eyes before she even realized it. Daniel appeared shortly after, coming from the hallway, without urgency, without surprise. He knew she would come, and he also knew this would be their last real encounter. He looked Laura in the eyes with the same kindness he had so often, but now without any expectations. It was the look of someone who had already left inside, of someone who no longer carried resentment, but also offered no shelter. He held out his hand, inviting her in, and she entered hesitantly, as if each step in that house was a confirmation that she no longer belonged there. She sat on the sofa that had once been hers, surrounded by new decor, new scents, voices and routines that no longer included her. The woman, who until then had remained in the doorway, discreetly moved away to the kitchen, leaving the two alone in the living room. Laura swallowed hard before saying anything. Her heart pounded, not because of what she was about to say, but because everything there seemed to scream that time hadn't just passed, it had passed over. She said she needed to see it for herself. She needed to understand. Daniel merely listened, with the patience he once used to preserve what existed between them. But now, he listened with detachment. With respect, but without surrender. Laura spoke of regret, of sleepless nights, of the silence that had consumed her since it all ended. She said she sometimes woke up searching for him, for his gestures, for phrases he used to say. And that only after losing him did she understand that he was the only person who had ever loved her consistently. Daniel listened in silence, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to absorb every last trace of pain so he could finally close the story. When she finished, he responded with something he hadn't expected. He said he understood. That he believed in her regret. But he also needed to say something, not as revenge, nor out of pride, just out of truth. He said that after everything, he too was lost. That he spent sleepless nights, that he considered leaving the city, that he tried to understand where he went wrong, what he failed to do, what he did too much. He said he felt small, invisible, disposable. But that, in a random cafe, between trying to move on with his life and taking a bitter sip, he found someone who didn't try to cure him, just listen. And that was what changed everything. That it was the first time in months he felt peace. And that, for him, this was worth more than any excuse. Laura took a deep breath, as if her heart were being squeezed inside. He said he knew who she was. That he always knew there was something there, even before everything happened. And that yes, he was envious. Always had been. Because she was the kind of woman who didn't need to try to be admired. Who didn't use excessive words or exaggerated gestures. Who simply was. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said something Laura would never forget. You always tried to be extraordinary for everyone, except me. And she never tried to be anything other than who she is. And that was enough. The sentence landed like a blow. But there was no malice. There was only recognition. And that was more painful than any judgment. Laura could no longer hold back the tears. She apologized, again. She said she deeply regretted it. And before leaving, she asked for just one last thing, that he be happy. That he recognize what she herself only saw when it was too late. Daniel walked her to the door. And with a slight nod, he said, I am. She left without looking back. Not out of force, but because she couldn't bear to see that world continue without her. She walked down the sidewalk as if carrying the weight of her wrong choices on her shoulders. The light breeze of that afternoon seemed to mock her inner state. Nothing about her was light. Her chest ached. Her eyes burned. Her mind replayed images, voices, silences. And, above all, the memory of that hug she didn't receive, that hand that didn't touch her, that house that no longer belonged to her. Laura's greatest punishment wasn't the loneliness. It was the contrast. Seeing that Daniel hadn't just survived, he'd flourished. And he'd done so with someone she'd never known how to value. The days that followed were silent. Laura avoided the places where she might encounter them. She changed her routine, moved, tried to rebuild her life with the pieces that remained. She withdrew from social media, from old mutual friends, and immersed herself in work as a way to avoid thinking. But nothing was enough. Because there was a kind of emptiness that couldn't be filled with busyness. It was a kind of loss that hurt even on good days. Even on days when the sun was shining brightly. Because what she lost wasn't just a love. He was a man who was there when she no longer knew how to be. It was the most sincere love she had ever received, and one she discarded, thinking she would have time to recover later. But later never came. Daniel, on the other hand, allowed himself to start over calmly. He learned to trust again, to say no, to not give up, to recognize the signs before they turned into scars. With someone who didn't demand masks, he found space to be himself, without fear of not being enough. He discovered that healthy love doesn't shout, doesn't suffocate, doesn't hide behind excuses. It simply exists. And it grows through care, through listening, through daily life. Every now and then, he remembered Laura. But not with pain. With maturity. As if remembering a phase that taught him something he would never accept again. And with that, he moved on. Months later, at a casual event, their eyes met again. A shy wave, a brief smile. There was no hurt. Just history. And in that silent exchange, they understood everything they needed to. Laura left first, walking slowly, her eyes brimming with tears. Daniel remained, wrapped in arms that now belonged to another body, another world, but which, for the first time in a long time, truly embraced him. And that was what mattered now. Because in the end, the greatest pain for those who betray isn't being hated. It's knowing you've lost the only person who still looked at you with love. And that this love, now, belongs to another place. To another time. And to someone who arrived without promising anything, but stayed. Laura began to walk with a silence embedded in her chest, the kind that doesn't echo externally but consumes her internally with the force of a contained hurricane. The reunion, which for so long had fueled a vague hope of reconnection or a final word capable of turning the key to the past, revealed exactly the opposite, the certainty that a path had now been traced that no longer included her footprints. She no longer carried anger, no longer harbored the urge to justify every mistake, nor did she see herself as a victim of circumstances. What consumed her was something else, deeper and more difficult to explain, the awareness that she had long possessed what many spend their lives searching for and that, when she had it in her hands, she failed to recognize. Now, all that remained was to rebuild not a relationship, but herself. And that was, perhaps, the most complex challenge of her life. On the outside, she maintained some composure. She returned to work with greater focus, dedicated herself to side projects, attended therapy sessions regularly, and even started taking morning walks as a way to organize her thoughts. But inside, the ground remained shaky. Any memory, no matter how small, could trigger an internal meltdown. An old song, a conversation between colleagues, a couple crossing the street holding hands. Everything reminded her not exactly of Daniel, but of who she was when she was with him, the woman she existed before she cheated, before she broke with everything solid. Sometimes she looked at her own reflection and didn't recognize herself. She was a stranger inside the body she had shaped herself, an identity disconnected from what she dreamed of being. Daniel, on the other hand, continued to build a new daily routine, based on small gestures of mutual care, light routines, and an affection that didn't demand performance. There was no desperation between him and his new partner to prove anything to the world. Everything was silent, organic, almost intuitive. And this lack of urgency allowed their bond to grow with firm roots. He relearned the value of full presence, of true listening, of intimacy built with patience. Conversations were no longer about crises, but about plans. The house now had other paintings, other scents, other memories forming. And, above all, a different kind of peace, one that wasn't passive, but earned. However, not everything was simple. Daniel, even though he was well, carried within himself a conflict that didn't easily disappear, the difficulty of trusting completely. Even though he was with someone honest, loving, and sincere, there were times when ghosts from the past tried to resurface. Small insecurities, hidden fears, silent questions. He didn't show it. But he felt it. Because when you're betrayed by someone you love deeply, the scar doesn't disappear, it just settles. And on certain days, it throbs. This sometimes made him withdraw. Not out of fear of the current relationship, but out of fear of himself. Afraid of closing himself off too much, of losing the lightness he had regained, of suffocating what was now being built because of a pain that was no longer part of the present, but that still whispered in the darkness from time to time. Laura also faced her own dilemmas. Her internal reconstruction forced her to take a hard look at her choices. She began to avoid blaming others, the world, or circumstances. She understood that, in the end, it was she who decided to cross the line. Not on impulse, but out of vanity. Out of mismanaged need. Out of an inflated ego. And that the betrayal wasn't an explosion, it was a sequence of small, daily surrenders, one by one, that distanced her from who she was with Daniel. And this awareness, instead of freeing her, suffocated her. Because it was irremediable. There was no going back. There was no starting over. And the forgiveness he gave her, though genuine, was a final point. An absolution that didn't mean a new chance, only mutual freedom. A silent dilemma arose from all this: how to move forward carrying the guilt of something that has already been forgiven but cannot be forgotten. Laura found herself in this abyss. She had been forgiven, yes, but that didn't alleviate what she felt inside. Because, contrary to what she imagined, forgiveness didn't heal, it merely revealed. It showed who she had become, what she had destroyed, and everything she would never be again. And that was devastating. Living with the weight of guilt that no one else carries is a silent punishment. There was no external rebuke. There was no judgmental voice. There was only the echo of her own conscience. Daniel also grappled with a question he hadn't expected: how to make room for a new love without having to prove himself different. As much as he trusted, as much as he was happy, there were days when he found himself questioning things he shouldn't. He thought about what he would do if he were betrayed again. What if one day I woke up and saw signs that it would all happen again? And in those moments, he fought his own fear. He told himself that trust was an act of courage, not a guarantee. That loving again was a necessary risk. And that he couldn't allow past mistakes to destroy the possibilities of the present. But it was difficult. Because wanting to forget wasn't enough. He had to rebuild faith in people. And that doesn't happen quickly. Amidst these internal conflicts, something unexpected happened. Laura was invited to participate in a lecture on professional ethics and corporate image. Initially, she declined. But after insistence, and considering it a way to reclaim her career, she finally accepted. She prepared the content carefully and reviewed her notes several times, but there was something about the topic that bothered her. Talking about ethics, after what she had experienced, seemed ironic. But when she took the stage, in front of dozens of young professionals, something different took hold of her. She didn't read the speech she had prepared. Instead, she spoke about emotional responsibility. About decisions. About consequences. Without naming names, she told her own story. Not as a lesson, but as a warning. She said that the choices we make in silence resonate louder than we imagine. And, at the end, she received a standing ovation. Daniel learned about the event by chance, through a colleague who was present and commented on how impactful the talk was. When he learned it was Laura, he felt a mixture of surprise and respect. He realized that, somehow, she was finding ways to redeem herself. He didn't say anything to his current partner. Not out of fear or secrecy, but because he understood that it was in the past. He simply kept a pang of relief to himself. Because seeing that she was trying to rebuild herself, without trying to return, without invading his present, was a sign that, finally, each of them had found their own path. Time passed. The wound stopped bleeding. And, little by little, the stories unfolded in different directions. Laura continued her journey with greater serenity, though the burden never completely lifted. Daniel, for his part, allowed himself to love again with greater freedom, facing his own fears and building a more fulfilling life. And, amidst all this, a complex feeling formed between them: respect. Respect for what they had lived. For what they had lost. And for what they had become. But there was still one last conversation to come. A conversation that wouldn't bring drastic changes, but would provide definitive closure. And it was about to happen. Their last conversation wasn't planned. There was no prior exchange of messages, no veiled promises of a reunion. It simply happened. A subtle coincidence, almost a whim of fate, on a random late afternoon. Laura was sitting outside a small bookstore cafe, a place she often frequented when she needed to think more clearly, and there, between a half-open book and a nearly cold cup of tea, Daniel appeared. Not grandly, not with purpose, but with the naturalness of someone who continues to live. He saw her before she noticed him, and for a brief moment he considered retreating, but he didn't. He approached slowly, without hesitation, and when she looked up, time seemed to slow down around her. There was no longer anger, no tension, nor the discomfort of the first few times. There were just two faces that recognized each other. And that was enough to make her smile. Daniel asked if he could sit, and Laura nodded lightly. They remained silent for a few seconds, but a silence unlike their old ones, now comfortable, respectful. He commented on the book on the table, and she said she was rereading old stories to understand how some words still had the power to heal her. Daniel smiled with his eyes. And then she said she was surprised to see him there. He replied that this place had become a refuge for him too, lately. And for the first time in a long time, they spoke again without the past hanging between their teeth. Without the weight of what had been, only with what remained, a human connection, pure, devoid of expectations. The conversation gradually deepened. They talked about work, changes in routine, people they'd lost along the way. They talked about who they are now, and how pain had forced them to look at themselves more truthfully. Laura mentioned the lecture, and he said he'd heard, but didn't want to intrude. She thanked him for it. She said she hadn't expected him to listen, but that, somehow, she wanted him to know she was trying to be a better person. Daniel stared at her for a while. He said he noticed that, indeed, she seemed more whole. And that he sincerely hoped she'd find something that made her proud. Laura lowered her eyes, touched. She said that, in recent months, she'd come to understand that some pain never completely goes away, but that we can still build on it. Daniel nodded slightly. And then came the pause. The one that precedes what needs to be said. Laura stared at him more firmly. She said there was something she'd never had the courage to say, but that if she didn't say it now, she might never get another chance. Daniel braced himself, but didn't show it. And then she began. She explained that, when things between them began to fall apart, there were times when she felt a kind of envy that embarrassed her. Not of his life, nor of his choices, but of the way he always seemed at peace with himself. She said she felt inferior, even though she was seen as the more extroverted, the more articulate. That, inside, she was at war. And that seeing someone so centered by her side, she began to sabotage herself. That she felt small in the face of the calm love he offered. And as contradictory as it seemed, that undemanding love confronted her. Because she'd never known how to receive something so pure without feeling she needed to do more, be more, achieve more. Daniel listened in silence. Not because he was shocked, but because, deep down, he'd always sensed it. He replied that he understood. That the way we love can often hurt, even when we don't mean to. He said he might have made a mistake by being too silent, by not saying when he was hurting, by not asking to be seen again. But that, even so, he never stopped loving her. He only stopped insisting when he realized that love alone doesn't save anyone. Time seemed to slow down. The words came unhurriedly, but heavy. Laura spoke of the emptiness she felt even on nights surrounded by people. She said she surrendered to that betrayal not out of passion, but as an escape. That she didn't feel true love for Gustavo, it was just the illusion of being desired again, of being the center of attention. And that, when everything fell apart, she understood that no momentary desire can fill the absence of a deep connection. Daniel listened without looking away. And then, softly, he said that everyone carries their own demons. That what she did hurt, yes. But now, after everything, he no longer wanted to live as a victim. He said he had already rebuilt himself, and that the pain was just a step in the transformation. Laura took a deep breath. She said that, in that moment, listening to him like that was harder than all the silences he'd kept. Because now she saw clearly everything she'd lost. Daniel smiled, but there was a gentle sadness in it. He said it wasn't about loss, it was about a cycle. And that cycles end when we learn to respect the pain they caused. He said he cherished what they had experienced, but that now he belonged to another time, to another version of himself. Laura nodded. You said you understood. And in that moment, she realized she no longer needed to apologize. Because he no longer carried the hurt. He carried only the memory. A kind of memory that no longer hurt. But which, even so, deserved to be treated with respect. They said goodbye there, with a sincere, long, wordless hug. A hug that promised no return, but sealed a peace that was slow to arrive. As Daniel pulled away and walked toward the exit, Laura watched. Not with desire. Not with regret. But with a kind of longing that doesn't hurt. Longing for who she was with him. For who he was with her. And for everything that, despite being lost, still taught her to be better. After that encounter, each went their separate ways. Daniel returned home with the ease of someone who has closed a circle with dignity. That same evening, he sat next to his new partner, took her hand more firmly, and told her about the encounter. He spoke calmly, transparently, and she simply listened. When he finished, she smiled and said, "Thank you for trusting me." And it was at that exact moment that Daniel realized, trust, now, was no longer a challenge. It was a mutual, conscious, and deeply real choice. Laura, for her part, continued writing. In one of the notebooks she carried in her bag, she began transforming memories into texts. Fragments of a past life that now took on a new function, to heal, to teach, to liberate. She no longer wanted to erase what she had experienced. She wanted to give it new meaning. Because pain that doesn't transform, imprisons. And she was, finally, beginning to understand what it meant to be free. The end wasn't a breakup. It was a crossing. And sometimes, the greatest form of love isn't staying, it's knowing how to leave. With respect, with truth, and with the courage to start over. Time passed, and the seasons changed as if they were chapters closing their own pages without warning. The leaves fell, the days grew shorter, and life continued its course without any major announcements. There were no final twists, nor any fanciful new beginnings. What occurred was the inevitable course of a real story, marked by choices, losses, and profound transformations. Each character was brought to a breaking point and then to a point of reconstruction. And it was precisely there, in the rawness of what cannot be undone, that each person's fate was sealed with a painful yet liberating clarity. Nothing was the same. But everything, in the end, was exactly as it should be. Laura went on alone. Not as punishment, but by choice. After that last encounter, she understood there was no point in trying to replace what she'd lost or seeking diluted versions of a love that no longer fit in the present. She decided to stop chasing something that no longer existed. She gave up superficial encounters, fleeting distractions, and forced attempts to move on just to prove she was okay. She began investing in something she'd always neglected, her own solitude. She immersed herself in her studies, returned to dedicating herself to social causes, and rediscovered old projects that had been shelved for years. And, most importantly, she began writing sincerely, not for others, but for herself. She transformed her memories into chronicles, her guilt into reflections, her failures into learning experiences. And, finally, she found peace. Not a euphoric peace, but a mature, discreet serenity that only comes when we finally accept the scars as part of our skin. She didn't rebuild a marriage, she didn't find another overwhelming love, she didn't have a romantic ending. She had something rarer, she had the courage to face herself and take responsibility. And that saved her from herself. Daniel, for his part, blossomed quietly yet profoundly. The relationship with his new partner didn't become the stage for grand public displays, but grew solidly, like roots planted in solid ground. With her, Daniel understood what it meant to be in a bond without fear, without uncertainties hidden behind averted glances. They officially moved in together after a while and built a light, mature routine based on dialogue, complicity, and each other's genuine presence. He returned to photography with passion, revived old projects he'd put aside, and began teaching photography workshops for young beginners. On more ordinary days, between a cup of coffee and a goodbye kiss, he finally understood that love isn't about fleeting intensity, but about constancy, truth, and respect. He never mentioned Laura again, not out of contempt, but because there was no more pain. Only respect for someone who was part of his history, but no longer part of his future. What began as a loss became a rediscovery of himself. Daniel was, in the end, the example that it is possible to start over after being broken, and still be whole. And as for the woman who opened the door that afternoon and gracefully faced the weight of a past that wasn't hers, but that haunted her present, she too had her place in the outcome. She showed that true love isn't what's imposed, but what embraces. She didn't need to fight for space, nor demand guarantees. Her love spoke through calm, listening, and patience with the silences Daniel carried. And so she was chosen not as a replacement, but as a path. He never asked for promises, never made comparisons. He was simply there. And this being was what set her apart from all the others. Her role, though silent to outsiders, was essential in giving Daniel the courage to not only forgive the past, but to embrace the present fully. Time has transformed everyone. But it was in the aftermath of betrayal that the most powerful lessons crystallized. Because, in the end, betrayal isn't just a mistake between two people, it's a rift that opens deep fissures, changes people's emotional geography, reconfigures values, and redefines trajectories. It doesn't just destroy love, it destroys admiration, pride, and fond memories. It takes away not only the relationship, but the feeling of home, of belonging, of shelter. And when that's gone, there's no excuse to rebuild. What's left is to deal with the broken pieces and hope they can still form something new, but never the same. Laura understood that the greatest punishment wasn't Daniel's abandonment, nor the subsequent silence, nor watching him rebuild his life with someone else. The greatest punishment was realizing, too late, that when you betray someone who truly loves you, you don't just lose them, you lose the right to your own story. Because memories become burdens, names become shadows, and love becomes scars. And with that, she had to learn to live with it. She chose not to retrace the same path, she chose not to seek new faces to paste over the one she lost. She chose to follow the path of honesty, even if painful, even if lonely. Because, in the end, she understood that the greatest act of maturity is not to try to revive what has already died, but to learn from the grief that remains. And that's how this story ends. Not with a spectacular comeback, not with poetic revenge, not with recycled clichés of loves that miraculously return. It ends with characters transformed by the choices they made, by the words they said or didn't say, by the hugs they didn't give, by the truths they ignored. It ends with the naked truth: betrayal tears from us something that cannot be recovered. And even when there is forgiveness, there will never be forgetting. Love that is broken by a lie never returns to its former self. It may even become something new, it may even evolve into respect or maturity, but it will never again be shelter. And in real life, that's exactly what hurts the most. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. What was the most memorable moment for you? What feelings did this story evoke in your heart? Your opinion is very important to us. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now. Here, all stories are created with the purpose of moving, impacting, and above all, teaching. We also leave you with an important reflection: betrayal destroys not only relationships, but identities. It breaks trust, undermines self-esteem, and corrupts what is most precious between two people: the truth. It's easy to give in to impulse, it's easy to convince yourself that the other person is to blame. What's really difficult is looking within and recognizing that the choice to betray is a solitary decision, one that generates consequences that no one else can bear for you. And finally, an essential reminder: this channel does not support any type of betrayal. All the stories told here are fictional, created to show the devastating effects that betrayal can have. We hope that, by listening to the end, you'll understand the depth of everything that's at stake when the trust of someone who loves you is broken. Until the next story. And may it not have to be yours.